Welcome, Voyager. You've just unfolded an old, sea-stained parchment. The candlelight flickers across the curled edge, revealing inked creatures, curling tails, and distant coastlines you've never heard of. Tonight, we'll sail into the 16th century, into the mind of a man named Olus Magnus, a priest, a scholar, and the mapmaker who dared to fill the northern seas with monsters. But not to frighten, to protect, to remember, to imagine. Cartography has always been a strange blend of science and superstition, like trying to draw the wind with a ruler. And speaking of misdirections, they say maps once warned, "Here be dragons," but really, it was just medieval GPS trying to say, "You probably shouldn't go here unless you've packed courage and extra biscuits." Anyway, if you enjoy these soft-sailed journeys into forgotten places, do like, subscribe, and leave a coordinate in the comments, somewhere you're listening from, or a place that's etched itself into your memory. Perhaps your location has a tale waiting in the tides of time. Now, Voyager, let the maps roll open in your mind. Let the ink soften. Let your breathing settle. The world is quieter than it seems. Feel the warmth of a low fire, maybe the whisper of parchment in your hands, and let yourself drift. Tonight we follow a map not for where it leads, but for what it dares to reveal. Our story tonight begins in the year 1539, in a Europe tangled with kingdoms, church bells, and superstition. It is the Renaissance, when the world was both awakening and still dreaming. In the northern reaches of Sweden, a man named Olus Magnus was already drifting between both worlds. Olus was a Catholic priest, forced into exile when Sweden turned Protestant. He found himself in Venice, surrounded by gondolas and golden mosaics, but his heart was still wrapped in the fjords and forests of the far north. Homesick and brilliant, he began to sketch, not only maps, but creatures, stories, landscapes that existed half in memory, half in myth. The result was the Carta Marina, or sea map, 9 wood-carved sheets wide, stitched together with care. It was among the first accurate depictions of Northern Europe. But accuracy had its shadows. Across the Greenland Sea, the Barents, and the churning North Atlantic, Olus populated the waters with writhing serpents, antlered whales, and red-mouthed krakens that dwarfed entire ships. One beast, shown off the coast of Iceland, has its jaws curled open, bearing rows of teeth and a long, spiked tail. Its name? Not given, but to those who studied it in later centuries, it resembled descriptions of the Hafgufa, a whale so large sailors mistook it for an island, until it yawned and swallowed them whole. Another section shows a group of fishermen harpooning what looks like a lion, with scales and webbed paws, pulling their catch toward a Nordic shore. All of it was drawn with the detail of someone who believed, or at least wanted others to. But why? You see, Olus was no ordinary artist. His map wasn't meant for travel alone. It was a defense of the North, a region many Southern scholars viewed as backward, barbaric, and frozen. In filling his map with monsters, he was, in a way, insisting, there is wonder here. There is knowledge, too, if you look past the teeth. More than a map, the Carta Marina was also a kind of memory. It cataloged not just geography, but fishing techniques, clothing styles, even the migration patterns of birds. Some creatures were exaggerated versions of real animals, walruses with dragon faces, narwhals mistaken for unicorns, but others seemed to belong entirely to dreams. He claimed to rely on the oral traditions of fishermen, Icelandic sagas, and old bestiaries. But one cannot help but wonder if Olus, isolated in Venice, felt the pang of longing so deeply that his creatures became companions. Each monster perhaps a guardian of a place he could not return to. The dragons, then, were not warnings. They were gatekeepers, not of danger, but of wonder. And there's something to be said for how often monsters appear at the edge of maps, in the corners, in the unexplored. They crouch like riddles, daring someone to go farther. They remind us that every voyage carries risk, but also the possibility of finding what no one else has. As Olus worked, so too did explorers sail. This was the golden age of maritime empires. Portuguese caravels swept down the African coast. Spanish galleons returned from the Americas. But in the cold north, where ice blinked in the sun and day turned to night in strange rhythms, the sea remained wild. The northern lights danced, volcanic islands simmered, and legends held sway over longitude. Even modern scholars have puzzled over Olus's intent. Was he lying or preserving something? In one strange episode, he describes a creature whose back is covered in fur and seaweed. The sailors climb aboard, light fires, cook food, only for the island to groan and slip beneath the waves. Again, perhaps the half-gufa, or maybe an echo from the Book of Jonah, or Islamic tales of whales that bore prophets across oceans. It's tempting to dismiss these as embellishments, as decorative flourishes meant to impress. But within each beast lies a deeper truth. Maps, after all, were not always about direction. They were also about reflection. What did the sea mean to you? Fear? Freedom? Mystery? When sailors of the Hanseatic League traced Olus's coastlines, they likely knew what was real, but they also understood that myth had weight. That telling a tale of a beast who swallowed ships could serve as a prayer against storms, a warning to novice captains, or simply a lullaby for a sailor's child rocked to sleep below deck. The Carta Marina was printed only a few times, then forgotten for centuries. Only in the 19th century did scholars rediscover its monstrous richness in a dusty Bavarian library. One of only 2 surviving copies, the other gone, vanished like many of the creatures it depicted. So the question remains, did Olus believe in the monsters, or did he simply believe in their usefulness? And perhaps it doesn't matter, because in the flickering quiet of night, when wind presses against your sails and the compass trembles ever so slightly, sometimes it helps to imagine that something ancient swims just beneath, something watching, something waiting, something that doesn't mind if you get a little lost. As our sails draw us deeper into Olus Magnus' swirling waters, the ink of his imagination thickens. His dragons, sea monsters, and hybrid beasts weren't placed randomly. If you trace your finger along the edge of the Carta Marina, you'll notice a quiet logic beneath the chaos. Olus grouped certain creatures near specific regions. The northern stretches near Iceland and Greenland, where volcanic vents rumble beneath the sea, are home to the kraken and the fiery serpents. The Baltic Sea, on the other hand, has quieter creatures. Whales with mournful eyes and seals with something nearly human about their gaze. This wasn't just flair. It was folklore arranged as cartography, and it's important to remember what sailors truly faced at the time. The Arctic seas were full of mirages, light bending over ice shelves, sun dogs circling the sky, phantom islands that vanished by morning. Volcanoes sent ash into the clouds without warning. Magnetic fields twisted compasses in ways no one could explain. To sail north was to sail into ambiguity. So Olus's beasts weren't decorations. They were metaphors for confusion, caution, reverence. The dragon off Norway's coast wasn't simply guarding treasure. It may have been guarding the line between the known and the unknown. There's a strange comfort in that, isn't there? To look out over gray, ice-flecked water and imagine a leviathan watching back, not with hunger, but with knowledge, that perhaps it sees the coast you cannot, that perhaps you are not as alone as the horizon suggests. And here's something else about dragons. In medieval bestiaries, they weren't always evil. Some were wise, Some protected sacred wells. Some curled themselves around forgotten cities and only stirred when disturbed. There's an old Norse belief that every coastline, every mountain range, had its own landvetter spirits that watched and whispered. To draw a monster, then, was to acknowledge a presence, to admit that a place had a soul. When Olus Magnus carved his dragons into the waves, he wasn't only mapping danger. He was drawing memory, grief, maybe even homesickness. Remember, he was in exile. His homeland had turned Lutheran, and as a Catholic clergyman, he could never return. His map became his country, his creatures, his people. And among the dragons there were ports. Among the monsters there were monasteries and markets, trade routes, anchors. No map can be entirely factual, not even now. Every chart leaves something out, highlights something else, tells the truth only in part. The Carta Marina did this unapologetically. It didn't pretend to know everything. It said, "Here is what we've heard. Here is what we fear. Here is what we hope." And those dragons, they don't appear in the middle of bustling trade routes. They hunch at the edges, the untraveled, the unreachable, the dreamt. One of the most fascinating creatures Olus included is the Ziphius, drawn as a snarling beast with the body of a fish and the head of a bird, attacking a merchant ship. Scholars debate whether it was based on sightings of orcas, or perhaps swordfish, or something else entirely. But the point isn't what it was. The point is that sailors remembered something sharp in the water, something with eyes. The Ziphius swims just below the Arctic Circle. Maybe, for Olus, it symbolized the threat of greed, or the cost of ambition, or maybe it was simply there to remind mariners, this journey is not like the others. Bring more than cargo. Bring respect. It's also worth noting that Olus's map wasn't the first to feature monsters. The Hereford Mappa Mundi, made 2 centuries earlier, showed monstrous races near the edges of the world. Men with dog heads, or no heads at all, their faces on their chests. Other maps drew sea pigs, barnacled bishops, or sirens with combs in their hands. But what made Olus different was scale. His creatures weren't on the sidelines. They were central, part of the sea's rhythm, threaded through it like currents. This was a map that didn't flinch from wonder. There's something poetic even now about that. Imagine a sailor folding open the Carta Marina in a candlelit cabin, tracing the fjords with calloused fingers. He sees a dragon curling near his planned course. Does he laugh or hesitate? Does he pray? Or does he, perhaps, whisper a story to the younger sailors about a time he saw something breach the waves just once, vast and black and silent, before it slid beneath? In our own age of satellites and sonar, we rarely encounter the unknown in such direct ways, but it still stirs beneath us. Not long ago, in the deepest trenches of the sea, a new species of jellyfish was discovered, one that pulses with light, nearly invisible except in darkness. In a way, Olus was right. The sea is still full of things we can't name. Only now we call them data instead of dragons. And yet, even modern cartographers sometimes honor that spirit. In the early 20th century, some charts still marked phantom islands, places once seen but never found again. Sandy Island, near Australia, or Maja, in the Gulf of Mexico. Tales of these places lived longer than evidence. They were believed into being, much like Olus's beasts. Toward the end of his life, Olus Magnus published another work, Historia de Gentibus Septentrionalibus, the history of the northern peoples. 1,000 pages filled with cultural practices, fishing techniques, legends, and yes, more monsters. In many ways, it was the prose version of the Carta Marina, but unlike the map, it gained wide circulation, translated into several languages, read across Europe. Still, the monsters lingered, and so did the man. Olus died in Rome in 1557, far from the coastlines he once etched, but his dragons swam on. His creatures, once carved by hand into woodblocks, now live in digital archives, museum walls, and whispered bedtime stories. And in them we find a gentle truth, that not all monsters are warnings. Some are invitations. Some are the guardians of what we've yet to understand. And some, perhaps, are simply reminders that wonder does not need explanation. It only needs permission. Let your eyes soften now. The waves are steady. The candle flickers low. So let us unfurl the final stretch of parchment, where ink meets edge, and where the monsters at last give way to silence. It is curious how memory and geography intertwine. One is fluid, the other fixed, or so we like to think. But as Olus Magnus taught us, even maps can dream. The Carta Marina, that woodcut atlas of beasts and bays, didn't just survive, it inspired. Long after his death, the dragons he carved reappeared in other forms. Children's books began to mention sea serpents with sapphire eyes. Engravings in later atlases kept the silhouette of his krakens intact, merely softening the scales. And scholars, centuries later, studied his monsters not as mistakes, but as metaphors, because Olus had mapped something deeper than water. He had mapped uncertainty, fear, hope, reverence. The map itself was rare. Only 2 original copies survive, one in Munich, another in Uppsala, Sweden. And when visitors gaze upon them now, they rarely walk away laughing at the beasts. More often they are quiet, moved. There is something strangely intimate about seeing the world as it once looked to someone who had no satellite, no globe, no airplane. Just stories, wind, ink, and conviction. He believed there was meaning in the monstrous. And when we look at the world today, our own continents shifting ever so slowly, tectonic plates murmuring beneath our cities, we still trace the same patterns. In some parts of the Pacific, Polynesian navigators once learned to read the waves themselves. Without instruments, without maps, they sailed across thousands of miles of open ocean, guided by the shape of swell and the flight of birds. They memorized entire archipelagos as songs. Their geography lived in rhythm, in story. And isn't that what Olus did? He sang the sea into form, even as the monsters coiled. Let us not forget that "here be dragons" is not a phrase Olus himself used. That line, so often cited as medieval shorthand for danger, is likely apocryphal. But the sentiment, that's real, because placing a dragon on a map was a kind of trust. Trust that future travelers would ask, would wonder, would proceed with caution and curiosity in equal measure. And in that sense, perhaps Olus Magnus wasn't just a cartographer. He was a dream keeper, a guardian of the edge. Today, cartography has become almost surgical in its precision. Satellite imagery, GPS coordinates, laser altimetry. We can scan every hilltop, sound every depth. But what we gain in accuracy, we sometimes lose in invitation. No dragon greets us at the end of the fjord. No Ziphius waits beneath our hull. But perhaps that is where we come in. As listeners, as voyagers of another kind, we can still seek the monstrous not as threat, but as wonder. Not long ago, bioluminescent creatures were thought mythical. Now we see them glowing in the dark, lighting their way through trenches deeper than Everest is tall. Giant squid, once thought fanciful, now drifts silently in the cold, proven but no less mysterious. Turns out Olus wasn't always wrong. He was just early, and perhaps, as you drift now into sleep, into the soft tide of thought, you too can feel the tug of his map, not in the hand but in the mind. Imagine holding the Carta Marina, Imagine tracing the inky spine of a dragon as it slips past Iceland. Feel the woodblock impressions pressed into vellum, the scent of sea salt on your sleeve. Maybe the monster is watching you back, or maybe, just maybe, it's smiling, because you see, the dragon was never meant to scare. It was meant to keep company, a creature for the lonely sailor, a companion for the frightened cartographer, a guardian of the unwritten. So rest easy, voyager. The map is still open, the candle still glows, and somewhere, far out on an ink-black sea, a dragon curls gently beneath the waves, keeping the world just strange enough to still be beautiful. Good night, and may your dreams chart only gentle waters. Welcome back, Voyager. On our second story of the night, we drift to the edge of the Atlantic, to a jagged coast where the sea wears its memory into stone. This is the story of a cave, not marked on most maps, not always visible, but known to those who listen carefully. A chamber carved by rhythm and pressure, hidden in the cliffs of Brittany, France. Locals say it sings, not always with voice, but with a trembling breath, timed with the tides. You know, for a country that gave us fine wine and impressionism, France's coastal cliffs might be its most dramatic artist, sculpting sea caves with nothing but salt water and persistence. Even Monet would have had to take a step back and say, "That's bold." Before we begin, I'd be ever so grateful if you'd like and subscribe. It helps the channel sail a little further. And if you're listening from anywhere touched by the tide, drop a coordinate in the comments below. Perhaps your coast too holds a hidden room that only opens when the sea is in the mood to share. Now breathe in slowly, Voyager. Let your shoulders drift downward. Imagine the cool hush of waves against rock, the smell of sea spray on old granite. Picture a sky streaked with gulls and a wind soft enough to lull the cliffs to sleep. Let yourself settle. The sea remembers, and now so do you. Our story tonight sets sail at Point du Raz, the westernmost point of mainland France. This windswept headland juts into the Atlantic like a broken finger, lashed by waves and legends alike. For centuries, sailors feared its waters, calling the narrow passage between Point du Raz and the Isle de Seine the Raz de Seine, a place of shipwrecks and sudden fog, where the sea behaves like it has secrets to protect. In the late 1800s, French naval hydrographers mapped this stretch of coast with painstaking care. Their records described not only dangerous currents and rocky shoals, but also a series of natural sea caves found at the base of the cliffs. These caves, many only accessible during extreme low tide, were carved into the granite over millennia by the force of the Atlantic swells. Some were shallow alcoves, others tunneled deep into the rock, large enough for a boat to drift inside, provided the water was calm and the wind held its breath. Among them was one cave, unnamed on the maps, that caught the attention of early coastal geologists. It lay hidden near a formation called Baie de Trépasses, the Bay of the Dead. According to Breton folklore, this bay was where souls of the drowned were said to embark on their journey to the afterlife. A poetic name, to be sure, but also grounded in history. The strong riptides and submerged rocks had claimed many fishing boats over the centuries. Bodies, when they surfaced, often washed ashore here. The cave we're speaking of tonight was not visible from land. It had no grand arch or mouth open to the sky. Instead, it appeared only when the tide was especially low and the Atlantic wind shifted from the southwest, pulling back the veil of seaweed and spray. Locals called it an uncouth breath, after the Breton personification of death, a skeletal figure who ferried souls across thresholds. They said you could hear the cave before you saw it. A long, low exhalation, as though the rock itself were sighing. Accounts from lighthouse keepers stationed at La Ville, just offshore, make mention of it in logbooks. In 1894, a keeper named Jules Morin described hearing a hollow groan that pulsed every few minutes, as though the wind had tunneled into the sea. He noted it in contrast to the sound of waves or foghorns, calling it alive and too regular to be random. He later joined a local naturalist to investigate the coastline during a spring tide, the period when the moon and sun aligned to cause the most extreme ocean levels. What they found, according to Morin's journal, was a narrow crevice exposed for less than 20 minutes, just wide enough for a man to slip through sideways. Inside, the passage expanded into a chamber, roughly 10 meters long, 5 high, with smooth, curved walls. The air within was cool and damp, echoing with each breath and footstep. What stunned them most was the sound, not crashing waves, but a consistent resonance, a kind of vibration that pulsed through the rock like a drumbeat or a throat clearing beneath layers of stone. Later analyses suggest the phenomenon is related to what's known as Helmholtz resonance, named after the 19th century German physicist who studied how air vibrates inside enclosed spaces. Think of the sound you make when you blow across the top of a bottle. Sea caves like the one at Point du Rest can produce similar effects when air is pushed in and out by changing tides and wave pressure. The shape of the cave, its length and opening size, acts like an acoustic instrument, a natural organ pipe beneath the sea. Geologists in the early 20th century returned to study it, but access was limited by the tide and weather. Photographs taken in 1921 show the dark slit in the rock just beginning to surface as water drains away. No official name was ever given, and most modern maps don't mark it at all. It exists in the margins, referenced in local oral history, mentioned in scattered journals, and hinted at in old hydrographic sketches archived in Brest. But in Brittany, stories don't fade just because ink does. A tale passed down in the village of Plogoff tells of a fisherman named Jan Arzel, who claimed to have rowed into the cave during a storm's eye. His boat, he said, was pulled forward by a current that disappeared the moment he entered. He described the sound as like sleeping beside a giant's heartbeat, and swore that inside, the air carried the scent of wet stone and something older, lichen, maybe, or salt that had never seen the sun. Arzel's story, though unverifiable, matches the details from scientific accounts, right down to the short window of accessibility and the echoing acoustics. His granddaughter once said he returned from that voyage quieter than before, spending his evenings watching the tide instead of drinking at the port. He'd row out sometimes not to fish, but simply to wait at a certain point in the water, listening. Arzel's habit of drifting out alone, anchoring just beyond the known reefs, became something of a local curiosity. Children would whisper that he'd found treasure, or that he met the Anku himself inside the cave and was told something he dared not repeat. The truth, as told later by his daughter, was simpler and stranger. He said the sea had a voice, and the cave was its mouth. Over the next few decades, others tried to find it. Hikers traced the cliffs of Baie de Trapasses with field glasses. A few amateur speleologists plotted tidal tables with the hope of catching the opening when the moon and wind conspired just right. But the cave resisted patterns. Some who knew where to look saw nothing. Others, by chance alone, heard the sound on a clear morning as the sea receded. A researcher named Louise Morvan, working out at the Université de Bretagne Occidentale in the early 1980s, compiled oral histories from residents in Plogoff and nearby towns. Many elderly locals recalled hearing the cave in their youth but not seeing it. A former lighthouse keeper, retired at the age of 92, insisted the sound had a feeling behind it, Like the cave wasn't just resonating, it was remembering. Morven's field notes include spectrograph readings taken near the base of the cliffs. On days when the phenomenon occurred, she recorded low-frequency vibrations between 50 and 90 hertz, frequencies known to travel far through rock and water. To the human ear, these sounds feel more like a presence than a tone, like standing in a cathedral as the organ breathes into silence. One local diver, Hervé Gachet, claimed to have reached the cave by swimming along the submerged base of the cliff during an unusually calm summer in 1986. He found the entrance barely wide enough to slide through, and within, he said, the water felt different, as if heavier, quieter. He described the chamber as bell-shaped, almost perfectly symmetrical, with narrow vertical striations along the walls as though carved with a chisel. He surfaced once inside, and sat in his wetsuit, floating beside the rock. There was light, he said, but no source for it. When asked to explain, he shrugged. The rock glowed, only slightly, just enough to see the outline of your own hands. No photos were taken. The cave closed again with the tide's turn. Gachet never found it a second time. Geologists, though intrigued, offered conservative explanations. The luminous walls could be attributed to phosphorescent algae clinging to the stone, or perhaps mica reflecting ambient light. The acoustics, as before, were explained by the chamber's shape amplifying the rush of water and air. But the elusiveness of the cave, its refusal to appear under controlled circumstances, left it in a space between fact and folklore. Still, it left traces on maps from the 19th century, in fishermen's logs, in whispered names like Tru Shantan and Sufal Dianku, names that survive longer in story than they do in ink. And the cave wasn't alone. Across the world, there are other places where sea and stone conspire to sing. In Scotland, on the island of Staffa, there's Fingal's Cave, a basalt formation that rings with natural harmonies when waves crash within. The poet William Wordsworth and composer Felix Mendelssohn both visited it in the 1800s, each inspired by its haunting echoes. Mendelssohn even composed an overture, the Hebrides, as a tribute to its strange acoustics. The idea that a place can have a sound, a mood even, has long fascinated artists and geologists alike. In New Zealand, the sea caves of the Bay of Islands behave similarly, creating audible tones depending on the tide's pull and the cave's depth. But none are known to vanish entirely from sight the way the Breton Cave does. By the 1990s, the scientific community had largely moved on. No conclusive findings, no repeatable measurements. But in Plogoff, the legend persisted. Children still paused by the cliff's edge on calm mornings, listening, not for proof but for rhythm, a kind of lull in the usual ocean churn, as if the sea were drawing breath for a song it might not finish. In 2012, a filmmaker named Claire Duarnenez attempted a short documentary on the cave's story, combining interviews with elders, archival drawings, and long, sweeping shots of the Baie de Trapasses cliffs. The film, titled The Breathing Stone, wasn't widely distributed, but at a regional festival in Finisterre, it earned quiet praise for its gentle pacing and eerie soundtrack. Captured audio from the rocks themselves, slowed and filtered until it resembled distant chanting. In one scene, an old man sits on a boulder as the wind threads through his hair. "I think it's a door," he says. "Not to anywhere exactly, but a door the sea likes to open, just to see who's paying attention." He smiles. "Sometimes I think it only opens when someone misses it." There's something profoundly human in that notion, that geography remembers us, that cliffs know our names, and waves wait for us to return, that a cave, carved by nothing but persistence and pressure, might open again not just for the right tide, but for the right kind of silence. Now, as we drift toward the end of this part of our story, let your thoughts quiet. Imagine the low thunder of waves against stone, distant but familiar. Picture yourself perched along the coast, watching as the water pulls back just a little further than usual. You see a line in the rock, no wider than a seam in fabric. You hear the soft vibration beneath your feet. You wonder if it will open for you. Our story draws closer now, like a boat returning home under the hush of twilight. It is 2021 when something curious happens. A group of acoustic ecologists from NOTS, studying coastal soundscapes for climate research, places an underwater microphone array near the cliffs of Plogoff. Their aim is to track changes in marine biodiversity through sound. The clicks of porpoises, the crackle of shrimp, the occasional grumble of a passing fishing trawler. But in one of their data files, time-stamped just after dawn on a still September morning, they find something else. A low-frequency pulse, repeating every 6 minutes, like a slow exhale. It peaks at 82 Hz, then falls away, resonating through. They share it online in a small report, noting the unidentified coastal resonance, and theorizing that it may be linked to a submerged cavity, occasionally flooded by tidal pressure. But those familiar with local stories, those who grew up with Arzel's Tale, or Théophile Marchand's journal, or who've read Louise Morvan's Quiet Field Notes, recognize the sound immediately. The cave had sung again, not loudly, not publicly, but enough to be recorded, enough to stir something in those who've always believed that truth can hum gently beneath legend. Later that same year, a painter from Quimper named Elise Trebern walks the cliffs with a sketchbook, chasing morning light across the channel. In one of her entries, scribbled hastily along the side of a watercolor wash, she notes that the sea was restless, but whispering. She draws a narrow cleft in the stone and labels it Presque une bouche, almost a mouth. That image finds its way into an exhibit at a small gallery in Brest titled Cartes de Mémoire, or Maps of Memory. The painting hangs in a corner, largely unnoticed until a visitor, a geologist from Marseille, pauses before it for nearly 20 minutes. When asked what he sees, he replies, "I think the sea wants to be heard, and it chooses very carefully who it speaks to." It's easy to dismiss stories like this, a cave that opens and closes with no schedule, a sound that carries intention, a chamber that hides not just behind tides, but behind time itself. But if you stand quietly enough by the water's edge, you begin to understand why people believed it. Because belief, like a cave, doesn't need to be seen to exist. It only needs to be heard. And the science doesn't contradict the legend. It dances with it. Blowholes and sea caves do form breathing structures. In areas with a steep drop-off or submerged hollow, pressure changes can force air through narrow passages in ways that mimic wind instruments. These caves don't hum at random. They respond to environmental cues so subtle, so complex, that even slight changes in salinity or wave direction can alter their voices. In Brittany's case, the specific geography of the Armorican Massif, combined with the abrasive Atlantic swells and centuries of slow erosion, creates ideal conditions for such features to exist, and to vanish again with a single storm. And so, the cave remains, neither proven nor disproven. It rests somewhere between topography and memory, between sea spray and breath. Perhaps that is the most powerful part of the story. Not that the cave exists, but that it might. That somewhere, on a morning with the wind just right, a seam in the rock could open for you. And that inside, not treasure, not monsters, not prophecy, but simply resonance. A note so low, so steady, that it quiets the parts of you usually too loud to hear it. Let your thoughts drift now. Picture that cliff again, bathed in soft Breton mist, its jagged edges blurred by the blur of salt wind. Hear the tide receding, not in waves but in long rhythmic pulls, the breathing of something vast and ancient. You walk slowly toward the seam, just wide enough to pass through sideways. Inside, the light is diffuse, silvery, like dawn caught in stone. You step in. It is cool, not cold. The walls shimmer faintly. You hear nothing at first, only your own breath. But as your heartbeat settles, a tone begins to rise. So low it feels like the vibration of your own memory. You sit, you close your eyes, and you listen. Outside, the sea waits, and somewhere the cave hums back. So rest easy, voyager. The tides know your name. The stones remember you, and the wave still keeps a secret tucked beneath its breath. Good night. Welcome once again, Voyager. On our third story of the night, we turn our gaze skyward, not to follow the stars or trace forgotten constellations, but to watch for something far stranger. Not birds, not rain, not drifting sails in the windless blue. No, tonight we wait for fish, because in a little corner of Honduras, in a town stitched between green hills and quiet roads, people say the ocean sometimes floats upward and falls from the clouds. They call it lluvia de peces, the rain of fish, a soft, silvery tumble from sky to street, as if the sea grew homesick for the land. We'll wander the warm cobbled edges of Yoro, the town where it rains what should never fly, and ask how such a thing can be, and perhaps gently we'll answer. They say meteorology is the only science that, when wrong, still gets to be on television. But imagine being so wrong, it rains sardines in your forecast. If you enjoy drifting through these strange coordinates with us, don't forget to like and subscribe, and leave your own coordinates in the comments. Let us know where you're listening from, especially if something odd has ever fallen from your sky. Maybe your place holds a story too, waiting to be told in another gentle night's wonder. Now inhale deeply just once. Feel the stillness settle like warm mist around your shoulders. Let your thoughts drift. Let the air soften. Imagine wet stone beneath your bare feet, the soft scent of ozone after a storm, the distant hush of palm leaves brushing against rooftops. Let the weather inside you match the quiet weather outside. And listen, our story tonight begins in the hills of Yoro, in northern Honduras, where something remarkable is said to happen, not once in a lifetime, but nearly every year. It usually begins in May or June. The skies gather, slow and silken, heavy with storm. Then the rains come, sudden and thick, not gentle showers but full, drumming, unrepentant tropical downpour. Thunder mutters along the ridgelines. Streets flood, tree roots drink deep. And then, as the storm quiets and clouds drift on, the people step out and find the fish. Not one or two, not the leftovers of a child's prank, but hundreds, small, silvery, gasping, sometimes still alive, squirming among puddles in the mud. They cover the streets, nestle in ditches, and scatter across gardens and rooftops. Some claim they arrive already cooked by lightning. Others swear the fish are a species not found in any nearby rivers. Locals have believed in it for well over a century, perhaps much longer. The first formal mention appeared in the 1800s, in documents left by Spanish missionaries, who described the miracle of fish from heaven as something both divine and routine. Later, in the 1970s, a team from National Geographic visited the town and, reportedly, witnessed the phenomenon, though whether they saw the fall or just its strange aftermath is still uncertain. Today, it's as much celebration as mystery. The people of Yoro hold a festival each year to mark the rain. There's music, parades, dancing in the streets, and fish, of course, grilled, fried, wrapped in banana leaves. Skeptics arrive with cripboards. Children come with buckets. The believers bring only patience, because the fish do come again and again. No one ever sees them fall, but they're there, as if slipped into the world while everyone was looking elsewhere. So what causes it? Scientists have proposed several theories over the years. One of the more accepted explanations involves waterspouts, tornado-like columns of air that form over the sea and can suck up small marine life into the sky. The theory goes that these waterspouts might form miles away on the Caribbean coast, scoop up schools of fish, and carry them far inland before releasing them during a storm. But Euro is over 100 kilometers from the ocean, and the fish found after the rains are almost always freshwater species, not saltwater. In fact, some studies conducted by biologists suggest that the fish may come from underground, that they aren't falling from the sky at all, but rather being washed up from subterranean streams or flooded caves beneath the town, brought to the surface by the intense rainfall, forced upward by pressure and rising water tables. But Euro is over 100 kilometers from the ocean, and the fish found after the rains are almost always freshwater species, not saltwater. In fact, some studies conducted by biologists suggest that the fish may come from underground, that they aren't falling from the sky at all, but rather being washed up from subterranean streams or flooded caves beneath the town, brought to the surface by the intense rainfall, forced upward by pressure and rising water tables. Still, the idea of fish from the sky is not unique to Honduras. Across the world, in places as far as India, Sri Lanka, and parts of Australia, similar reports have surfaced. In 2004, hundreds of small perch reportedly fell from the sky in Kerala, India, after a particularly violent monsoon. In Thailand, villagers once gathered armfuls of fish after a rainstorm in the northern hills. Even in the United States, there are records, most famously in Texarkana, where in 2021 a storm left dozens of fish strewn across parking lots and schoolyards. There is something deeply unsettling and beautiful about the idea that the sky, for a brief moment, becomes an ocean, that clouds might contain memory or mercy or just a bit of confusion. In Euro, though, it's more than weather. It's folklore, it's faith, it's biology and mystery and Sunday afternoon combined. A story that has been passed from grandparents to grandchildren, not with scientific rigor but with the tone of something true. Not provable necessarily, but certainly believable. There's a difference. People tell of times when the fish came in such numbers they clogged the gutters and had to be swept away like autumn leaves. One woman recalled walking barefoot and feeling them wriggle under her soles. Another claimed she heard them before she saw them. A faint ticking sound like raindrops on a tin roof, only heavier, softer. And always it comes with the rain. Always it begins with thunder and ends with silver. No one has ever photographed them mid-fall. No scientist has caught them tumbling through the air. Yet every year after the storms they are there, not just scattered on open ground, but sometimes tucked into baskets left outside, or nestled beneath trees, or found squirming on rooftops with no access from below. It's as though the earth itself exhales them, or the clouds slip them from a fold in their hem, like forgotten coins. There is a particular kind of calm that follows one of these rains. After the awe, after the gathering, after the questions and the cameras, the streets fall quiet, just puddles and shimmering, glistening scales in the dust. It is not a miracle that shouts. It doesn't demand belief. It waits. If you ask the elders of Euro, they'll speak of the late priest, Father José Manuel Subarana, a Spanish missionary who came to the region in the mid-19th century. Subarana is said to have been deeply moved by the poverty he found. Food was scarce, the soil harsh, and so, the story goes, he knelt and prayed. long and hard, for 3 days and nights, that God might provide sustenance for the people. On the 4th day the skies opened, and the fish came with the rain. From then on, the phenomenon repeated itself, almost always after especially strong storms, as if in response to that original desperate prayer. Whether this legend is rooted in reality or not, it has become a core part of the narrative. A miracle not bound to one time, but returned each season, as if on a vow. There's something poetically cyclical about the idea. Storms, prayer, rain, fish, need and gift. Nature responding not just with punishment or indifference, but with kindness, or at least with surprise. To understand how fish might survive such a journey, be it from sky or subterranean chamber, scientists have noted their peculiar resilience. Many of the species recovered after the rains are small, hardy, and capable of surviving brief periods without water. They seem dazed, certainly, but often recover if placed quickly into nearby streams. Some are taken home and cooked. Others are gently returned to the rivers by children, as though putting something odd and precious back where it belongs. And Uro's landscape supports such oddities. The geology of the region includes porous limestone, riddled with underground passages and aquifers. In rainy seasons, water pressure can change dramatically in such networks. A sudden surge could, in theory, displace whole pockets of life and push them upward through cracks or sinkholes. What the eye sees on the surface, a dry street, a puddled road, is not the whole truth of what lies below. The earth breathes, too, and sometimes it breathes fish. In 1997, Honduran TV stations aired footage of locals collecting hundreds of small fish off the pavement following a storm. The footage is grainy, but earnest. Smiling children hold buckets aloft. A man lifts one from the ground and shows the camera. They appear again year after year, never on the same day, never with a warning. No alarm is needed. The town waits, and the fish arrive. Some villagers claim the fish are always the same kind, blind, white, like creatures that dwell in darkness. Others report more variety, including tiny catfish or sardine-like swimmers. Reports vary, and perhaps they should. Memory is a tide. What it leaves behind shifts each time it comes to shore. The people of Uro don't all agree on what the phenomenon is. For some, it is science partially understood and still unfolding. For others, it is a gift, unwrapped not by explanation but by experience. For most, it's both, and that coexistence is where the story breathes best. Because the rain of fish, as unlikely as it may sound, is not a fairy tale born of distance or ancientness. It is current, it is calendar marked, it is filmed and photographed. And yet, even with modern tools and inquiry, it resists full capture. It remains soft around the edges, like fog, like folklore, like a dream you half remember on waking. In that way, it resembles other phenomena around the world that blend meteorology with myth. In Japan, there are stories of amifurashi, rain summoners, spirits said to bring storms as omens or gifts. In Norway, legend tells of fiskren, fish rains said to follow after great offerings to the sea gods. In India's Assam region, frog rains are spoken of, with tiny amphibians falling like droplets after heavy monsoons. Each culture, faced with the improbable, seems to wrap its explanation not just in weather patterns, but in wonder. Perhaps what makes Uro's fish rain different is its persistence. Most fishfall stories around the world appear once or twice, anomalies in the historical weather record. But Uro's tradition continues. Its story is still being written, each season, with muddy footprints and silver scales. In 2003, a scientist named Oscar Fernandez, working with the National Autonomous University of Honduras, tried to catalog the types of fish found after the rains. His findings were never fully published, but he noted that many of the specimens lacked pigmentation, a sign, he suggested, that they had lived in darkness. Perhaps, again, in those underground streams. Perhaps in places untouched by sun or surface. If true, then the rain of fish is not about falling from the sky at all. It is about emergence, about something rising briefly into our shared world from one we do not often see, like deep-sea fish caught in nets, blinking at the sun, like old stories surfacing in new mouths. So many things in life are like that. Myths that brush against science, nature that gestures toward story, weather that delivers surprise instead of destruction. A child once told a visiting reporter that the fish come because we are lucky, and when asked what he meant by lucky, he simply said, because they come to us. There is a certain hush in that logic. Not everything must be understood to be appreciated. Some truths come in puddles and shadows and whispers, and sometimes they come with rain. In Euro, it's just something that happens. In other places, it might be a fable. Here, it's fish. And what of the sky? If the fish do not fall from it, at least not in the theatrical, feather-light way we imagine, then why do so many insist they do? Why has the image held on for so long? That of dark clouds rolling in, the first crack of thunder, and then the silver rain. Fish falling like stories, like stars, like forgotten wishes. Maybe because it's beautiful. Maybe because the idea of the sea returning its children to the land, through the clouds, is a kind of quiet poem we've always wanted to believe in. That there is a soft cycle, a communion between worlds. That the boundary between sky and sea and soil is not so fixed after all. That sometimes, if only for an hour, the rules rearrange themselves. Fishermen in Euro have a word for it that they murmur without thinking: bendition, a blessing, not a phenomenon, not a weather event, not a question to be solved, simply a moment to witness, a soft rearrangement of what's expected. Children chase the puddles barefoot. The streets are wet and worn. There is laughter, but it is subdued, as if the air itself has a hush stitched into it. Fish are gathered carefully, placed into bowls or buckets, or, in some households, laid onto banana leaves to dry in the sun. Not wasted, not celebrated with drums or banners, just received. Each family has its own little ritual. Some fry them with plantains and lime. Others preserve them with salt for leaner weeks. Some keep one fish aside, uneaten, uncleaned, set in a small jar by a windowsill. Not quite a relic, not quite a token, just proof, or maybe a reminder, that the earth still surprises us, that not all magic needs trumpets and fire. And outside Euro, the world continues. Some scientists scoff, but gently. There is no hoax here, no deception. Just the maddening difficulty of confirming something that never happens under a microscope. There is footage, yes. There are testimonies, recordings, studies. But what there isn't, what there has never been, is certainty. And what a relief that is. Certainty, after all, tends to close the door. But wonder leaves it slightly ajar, the wind moving through it just enough to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the sea can climb trees and the clouds can whisper fish names in the world. When it wants to, can blur the lines between below and above. It's not a phenomenon that needs solving. It's a lullaby, the seasonal exhale. A reminder that nature is not just function, but also gesture. That the sky may very well offer us a story instead of just rain. And if we gather it quietly, if we accept the story without shouting it into diagrams and headlines, perhaps it will keep coming. There is an old man in Euro, nearly 90, who has witnessed the rain of fish more times than he can count. He sits on his porch in June, watching the clouds, sipping from a tin cup. He doesn't hurry when the winds pick up. He doesn't run to gather. He waits, and when the fish come, he only smiles. "They're not falling," he once told a journalist. "They're arriving, and isn't that the better word? Arriving, not dropped or dumped or conjured, not miracles that demand applause, just small arrivals, quiet affirmations that the world still moves in rhythms older than radar, older than science, older than even prayer. Rhythms that don't need naming to be real." In recent years, the festival of the Uvea de Pacis has grown. Tourists arrive in Euro hoping to glimpse the event, to film a falling fish, to make sense of the story. But often they miss it. They sleep in the wrong inn. They leave too early. They blink, because the fish do not follow schedules. They do not announce themselves. They arrive like dreams, halfway into waking. Some say they choose their audience. Others say it is the Earth's secret to keep. A dialogue not for headlines, but for hearts that still know how to listen. In every corner of the world, there are stories like these. Places where the elements don't behave, where rivers run backwards during full moons, where birds forget to migrate, where lightning dances on calm lakes. We often label them anomalies. We archive them into footnotes. We try to solve them like puzzles. But sometimes they are meant to be held, not solved. They are not riddles. They are lullabies. And tonight, as you lie in the soft hush of your room, with the faint hum of your world winding down, imagine the sky not as a ceiling, but as a door. And imagine for a moment that beyond that door is a sea, and that sea remembers you, and that every now and then, when the clouds are heavy enough and the winds are warm enough, it sends something back. Something small, something silver, something that once swam in silence and now lands, soft and shining, in your open hand. That is what Euro believes. Not that fish fall from the sky, but that the world remembers. And sometimes when we are quiet, it answers. Thank you for drifting with us through tonight's gentle tide of wonder. If this story brought you calm or curiosity, leave a like and subscribe to stay close to our quiet cartography. And if your skies have ever surprised you, drop a coordinate in the comments. Perhaps your story will be the next to rise like mist from the land. Sleep well, Voyager. May your dreams be soft as rain, and your questions always be met with hush and awe. Welcome back, Voyager. On our final story of the night, we walk where the ocean steps aside. A tale told in hours, in moments measured by seaweed clocks and tide-worn paths. This is the story of a disappearing island, a patch of stone and grass that appears only when the sea agrees to let it. In the archipelago of Orkney, off Scotland's northern coast, there exists a landform so shy it must be timed with a watch and a prayer. A tidal island, they call it, visible only for a few quiet hours each day, before the sea returns to smooth its footprints away. You know, they say some land is so private it makes you knock before stepping on it. But in Orkney, it's the sea that holds the key, and the lock is made of salt and patience. Before we step across this shifting causeway, don't forget to like and subscribe. If these meandering stories call to you like a distant bell through fog, drop a coordinate in the comments. Let us know where you're listening from, and perhaps your shore hides a tale worth telling next. Now, allow your breath to slow just a little. Let your thoughts settle like sand in a tidal pool. Close your eyes if you like, or keep them half-lidded like a lighthouse dozing at dusk. Feel the soft hush of brine in the air, the murmur of waves kissing stone. Let the tide of sound draw you in, and gently anchor your mind to stillness. Our story tonight begins, as many do in these northern islands, with wind and rock and a thread of memory that loops through generations like a knotted rope. Just south of the larger island of Sandy lies a tidal islet known locally as Cled Head. It does not appear on most modern maps by name, and you won't find it listed in travel guides. But among older residents, especially the fishermen and the keepers of folklore, it is spoken of with a certain reverence. Not for its grandeur, it is barely the size of a football field at low tide, but for its behavior. The island is accessible by foot only twice a day. Each window is brief, just over an hour before the sea creeps back across the sandbar that connects it to the mainland. To walk to Cled Head, one must understand the sea like a living thing. You must learn its moods, its rhythms, and more importantly, respect its authority. It was first formally noted in an 1832 maritime survey commissioned by the British Admiralty, led by hydrographer George Thomas. His notes mention a low stone reef that becomes dry at ebb, with signs of habitation or former structure. The phrasing is peculiar, former structure, as there is no known record of buildings on Cled Head, and yet fragments of stone worked by hand do exist along its southern rim. Square cuts, as if part of a foundation, now partially swallowed by lichen and time. Local oral histories speak of a croft, a small dwelling, used by a reclusive widow in the early 1700s, said to have lived alone among the seabirds, tending a garden of sea kale and wild leek. But the tides eventually made permanence impossible. She left, or so the story goes, one autumn storm when the sea forgot to recede, and never returned. Much of Orkney is shaped by such whispers. It is a place where history and myth share a pillow. Cled Head is not alone in its vanishing act. Across Britain's coasts there are dozens of tidal islands. St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall, Lindisfarne in Northumberland, Berg Island in Devon. But Cled Head is different. It does not boast chapels or castles or inns. It does not light up for tourists. It waits quietly for the attentive. What makes these islands possible is a geological formation known as a tombolo, a natural land bridge formed by the deposition of sand and gravel, connecting an island to the mainland. These connections are delicate, formed by prevailing wave patterns and currents, and constantly shifting. In Cled Head's case, the tombolo is so narrow that even a mild shift in wind or current direction can flood it unexpectedly. In 1937, a postmaster named Alistair Muir kept a detailed weather journal in Sandy. His notes described how Cled Head's visibility fluctuated not just by tides but by atmospheric pressure. Barometer fell sharply last night, he wrote on June 14th, and the sea came in faster than the moon allowed. That poetic phrasing, faster than the moon allowed, might not hold up to strict oceanography, but it captures something true. For tidal islands, the moon is a landlord, and every step on dry sand is a rented moment. Muir's journal also includes hand-drawn maps, annotated with walking times based on lunar cycles. One footnote, written in faded ink, reads, "Never go after the bell sounds twice." No one knows what bell he meant. Satellite imagery today confirms the presence of a tombolo connecting Cled Head, barely 2 meters above sea level at its highest point. Vegetation surveys show wild thyme, thrift, and sedum clinging to its center. Birds nest there in summer, mostly Arctic terns and oystercatchers, and they arrive just before the solstice, as if waiting for the sea's permission. An ornithologist named Fiona Bell published a paper in 2011 on migratory patterns in Orkney's smaller islands. Her team noted that the birds seemed to favor Cled Head despite its instability. They returned to a vanishing place, she wrote, as if drawn by something we cannot measure. Perhaps memory, perhaps sound. And indeed, sound is part of Cled Head's story. Walkers who have made the crossing speak of a strange hush that falls when you step onto the island, as if the sea, having parted for you, now listens. Wind passes differently there, not louder but more purposeful, a kind of focused stillness, as if even the gulls know the clock is ticking. There is no marker on Cled Head, no plaque or flag, but those who have walked there leave offerings, small stones arranged in spirals, shells placed in lines, not for worship perhaps, but in thanks, as if to say, I was here and the sea allowed it. It is not uncommon for visitors to become stranded. In 2004, a couple misjudged the return tide and had to be rescued by a passing trawler. The man later told local radio, "We thought we had more time, but the sea was quicker than memory." And still, they went back the next year. On a misted morning in early spring, 1968, the sky over Sandy was low and soft, the kind of gray that swallows shadows and swaddles the sea in quiet. A schoolteacher named Isla Flett, who had moved from Edinburgh to Orkney for what she thought would be a single year, set out to walk the tide line. She had heard whispers of Cled Head from her students, spoken like a secret past between generations, the island that played hide and seek, the place that could vanish even while you watched it. Armed with a thermos of tea and the kind of curiosity that moves the feet more than the mind, she crossed the strand just as the water began to pull back. It was her first time attempting the walk, and she brought a small notebook with the intent of sketching wildflowers for her classroom. But as she stepped onto the tombolo, something in the air changed. She would later write, "It was as though the sea had exhaled and taken all the noise with it. No beatson, no rustle of breeze, just the soft crush of her boots over damp sand and the distant murmur of retreating waves." Cled Head rose gently before her, a low curve of land barely distinguishable from the mainland cliffs. From a distance, it appeared unremarkable, but as she reached the island's edge, she noticed something strange. A series of shallow depressions in the earth, too regular to be natural, like the remains of post holes. She followed them in a slow arc, each step measured. The wind seemed to circle inward. There were no trees, of course. Trees do not grow on tidal islands, but there was a silence that felt tall, like standing in a clearing. She sat and waited, not for anything in particular, but because something in her body told her not to leave just yet. After 20 minutes, she heard the sound. Not a voice, not a tune, but a vibration, like the tremble of a plucked string carried through stone, came from the ground itself. Faint, yes, and inconsistent, but there. She stood, turned in place, and felt it strongest along the southern rim, the same area described in the 1832 Admiralty Survey. Flett's experience wasn't shared publicly until years later. In a local publication on the folklore of the Northern Isles, her account matched, nearly word for word, the sensations recorded by others who had made the crossing before and after her. The feeling of being watched, the sudden hush, the humming earth, and always the urgency to leave, not from fear, but from knowing that the sea was on its way back. Since the 1970s, several geologists and archaeologists have attempted formal studies of Cled Head. Each effort has been constrained by the tide. In 1993, a team from the University of Aberdeen set up sensors to measure microseismic activity. They wanted to understand the subterranean structure of the island and determine whether the vibrations could be attributed to coastal erosion, shifting fault lines, or tidal pressure in underground chambers. They found that the tombolo connecting Cled Head was indeed fragile, consisting primarily of unconsolidated sand and shingle. But what intrigued them most were the acoustic anomalies, subaudible frequencies recorded at the exact times visitors reported hearing or feeling the island hum. Their findings were never formally published in a major journal, but the raw data, archived in digital form, suggests that the island itself responds to tidal movement not just physically but sonically, a kind of pressure-activated resonance. In other words, Cled Head sinks, very softly, but only when the sea says so. Perhaps most fascinating are the accounts collected in the early 2000s from local shellfish harvesters, who, unlike tourists, interact with the tides daily. One man, Tam McGregor, claimed he avoided the island altogether. "It's too quiet," he told a visiting researcher. "Not the good kind. The kind where you feel like you're being told something you can't quite hear." Another, a woman named Elspeth Craig, had a different take. She described the walk to Cled Head as a ritual. "It's like being allowed to borrow the world," she said, "just for a little while, and you always give it back." There are no houses on Cled Head, no ruins, no buried treasure or ancient graves, but perhaps the story doesn't need that. What it offers instead is a reminder that some places cannot be owned, or lived on, or even fully studied. They can only be experienced, briefly, quietly, like stepping into a breath held by the ocean. In literature, the motif of vanishing islands is older than we remember. From High Brazil off the coast of Ireland to the mythical Cantor Gaelad in Wales, there have always been stories of lands that reveal themselves only to the attentive, places that slip in and out of maps like ghosts. Cartographers of the 15th and 16th centuries often noted such islands with annotations like "seen by sailors in fine weather" or "land appears, then disappears." Some were mirages, others sandbars, and some, like Cled Head, were real but only briefly so. In 2015, a local youth group in Orkney hosted a walking tour during spring's lowest tide of the year. They called it the Walk Between Worlds. Poetic title, perhaps, but fitting. Participants were given small notebooks to record their impressions. Most wrote about the silence, the salt in the air, the light on the wet stones. But one child, age 9, wrote something that has since become part of island lore. "I think the island is like a secret the sea is trying to keep, but sometimes it laughs and lets it out. That line now lives on a plaque mounted on a rock at the start of the Tombolo. It's not always visible, depending on the tide, but when it is, it reminds walkers that they're stepping not just onto land, but into story." By 2020, Cled Head had become something of a local pilgrimage. Still not marked on many maps, still not commercialized, but known, passed down by word of mouth and careful timing. The community set up a tidal clock near the closest village to help people plan the crossing. But even with precise timing, the sea sometimes keeps the island to itself. A change in wind, a shift in pressure, a pause in the moon's steady pull, and the path remains submerged. And so, Cled Head remains a lesson in rhythm, in restraint, and in reverence. It is not a place to conquer. It is a place to visit, to listen, and to leave. Our story nears its close in a way befitting an island like Cled Head. Not with a crescendo, but with a quiet recession, like the tide itself easing back into the folds of the sea. In the early morning hours of May 12, 2022, during what would become one of the lowest spring tides in recent decades, a small group of naturalists from Kirkwall made their way across the Tombolo. They had planned for months, tracking lunar patterns, barometric pressure, and local folklore. This wasn't a scientific mission in the strictest sense. Their aim was more poetic, to walk the rhythm of the sea and listen for its quieter offerings. They carried little more than field journals, anemometers, and handheld hydrophones, devices used to capture underwater sound. The sky that day was a glass dome of pearl gray, and the sea lay as still as a breath not yet taken. Upon reaching Cled Head, the group fanned out, some examining flora among the wind-polished rocks, others trailing their fingers along the rough granite walls, listening. One of them, a woman named Sorka Reed, noticed a cluster of circular depressions filled with brackish pools. Within one, she saw what looked like tiny ripples, too small to be wind-stirred, too rhythmic to be accidental. Placing her hydrophone in the water, she recorded a low, looping frequency that pulsed like a whisper passed between stones. Later, when the audio was played back and the ambient noise filtered out, the sound resembled a heartbeat, a slow tidal thump, not mechanical, not geological, simply alive in the way old places sometimes are. What fascinated Sorka most, however, wasn't the sound itself, but what came just after. As she stood over the rock pool, the ripple stilled, and the silence returned. Not the absence of sound, but a full-bodied quiet, the kind that fills the ears rather than empties them. In her notes, she wrote, "I think Clet Head doesn't want to be measured. It wants to be met. Is this relationship between listener and landscape, between patience and presence, that seems to define places like Clet Head. Because what is a tidal island if not a geographical metaphor for everything we can't quite hold, appearing just long enough for us to question what permanence really means? And this isn't unique to Orkney. Across the globe, similar tidal islands offer brief, walkable glimpses into other rhythms of time. Mont Saint-Michel in France rises like a dream out of tidal flats, its abbey haloed in mist when the sea returns. St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall, England, shares the same saint and same sacred solitude, linked to shore by a cobbled causeway visible only at low tide. In Korea, the island of Jindo holds a phenomenon known as the Miracle Sea Road, where the tide parts just enough to allow passage between two islands for a short time each year. Locals and visitors alike gather to witness the sea stepping back, if only for a moment, like a deity in retreat. Even in Canada's Bay of Fundy, famous for its massive tidal range, entire landscapes appear and vanish, beaches turn to sea in the span of an hour, and islands that were moments ago accessible become dreams adrift in open water. These places remind us of something elemental, that time doesn't only pass in minutes and years. It also passes in tides, in shadows that lengthen across stone, in winds that rise at dusk and settle before dawn. Clet Head and its kin are not destinations, not in the traditional sense. They are temporal coordinates, found not on maps but in the muscles of the sea. So why does this island only appear at low tide? The simple answer is geology, sediment and structure, and the moon's stubborn pull. But the deeper answer may be one only whispered by those who have made the walk and felt that hush come down like a shawl around their shoulders. Because maybe the island doesn't appear at low tide. Maybe we do. Maybe it's us who are revealed in those brief, salt-blown hours. Our willingness to wait, to listen, to walk slowly over shifting ground for no reward other than wonder. There's a kind of humility in that, a kind of reverence we don't often allow ourselves in the modern world. We fill silence with noise, stillness with motion, and spaces with things. But Clet Head offers none of those. It offers only a question, repeated with every tide. Will you come, and will you leave with soft steps? And so the island becomes a teacher, one whose lessons are written not in books, but in seaweed and silence, in disappearing footprints, in the way the light moves differently when you're standing on borrowed land. Isla Flett, the teacher from 1968, would later say that her walk to the island changed something in her. She stayed in Orkney longer than planned, eventually retiring there. Her former students say she always kept a rock from Clet Head on her desk, smooth and sea-worn, and she would sometimes tap it with her finger during long pauses in conversation. Not out of habit, they think, but as a kind of punctuation, a reminder that some truths need no words. In the end, the mystery of Clet Head is not one to be solved. Like the tides, it is meant to be felt, observed, and ultimately released. Perhaps, one day, you too will stand where sand gives way to sea, and watch as the path unfurls like a ribbon thrown across the water. And when you reach the island, you'll know to keep still, to listen, and to feel the earth murmur beneath your feet. and maybe, just maybe, you'll hear it hum back. Thank you for sailing through this soft moment of tide and stone. If this story found you at the edge of sleep, or stirred a memory of a quiet coastline, please leave a like and subscribe for more gentle journeys. And as always, leave a coordinate in the comments where you're listening from, or where the sea once whispered something only you could understand. Sleep well, Voyager, until the tide returns.